Now I want to focus on our speaker, Glenn. And normally I would spend a little bit of time telling you about him, but I'm not going to do that because you all know of him already, and you're here because you know him or you're aware of him. And I really don't want to cut into his presentation time. And as part of his presentation, you'll see the amazing background that this man has had and the impact he's had on languages. So without further ado, I want to introduce Glenn Nordin, and this topic will be language and U.S. national interest, past, present, and future. Glenn?
Well, as usual, I haven't prepared for this very well. I sent him a bunch of slides. I thought I'd write to those slides. But as I looked around and saw who was going to be in the audience, I said, I can't say that. I can't tell about that. Anyway, some personal history on me. There's a lot of talk here about the positions I held. I had a wonderful career in the military and a wonderful career as a civilian, as a defense contractor, as a civil servant. I can't tell you how great it was to hang up after 62 years of working. I decided it was time when I reached 85. But to start, I was exposed to language at a very early age. My father was first-generation Swedish American farmer. My mother was a first-generation Norwegian American school teacher. I grew up with a group of kids who spoke what I would call Svennorglish. When I joined the Army and on assignment to the Army Language School, I was proud to talk to a teacher, a Swedish instructor, and she told me that I spoke very well, but whatever language it was not understandable Swedish. That is the reality for so many so-called heritage speakers. The first generation born here may speak the language of the house, kitchen, bedroom, yard, or farm, or McDonald's, but unless provided education in bilingual school, will not be able to interpret for most societal or business transactions. The lesson is that being a heritage speaker does not necessarily qualify a person to be a translator. And yet every day in this country there are kids going to do interpretation for their parents or translation for their parents in school systems, in healthcare systems, etc. We've got to figure out a way to get around that. Teach more English. My first Army training was a high-speed manual Morse radio operator. Terrible, terrible thing, all day long. And after graduation, I was pleased to be asked to volunteer for Russian language school. What did I know about language learning? Nothing. And people told me that learning a language was just like learning Morse code. Well, that argument persists today for some people. They will tell you that it's still just another code system. And in fact, some schools are equating learning computer coding with learning a second human language. There is no way that you can do that type of code either and call it the difficulties of learning a human language. The Army and National Security Agency provided me a pathway of 3 years exposure to Russian language spoken by natives in classroom and personal relations. On assignment after completion of the Army Foreign Language Specialist Program, and by the way, there's a fellow alum here of that school, Alan Turnbull. We had a wonderful tour there, 2 years in Oberammergau or Garmisch, I don't know which part of it you were in. I felt after completing that 2 years of training, 6 hours a day classroom, followed with, because I was a second lieutenant at the time, promoted, I guess, while I was there, to first lieutenant. But the colonel in charge said, Glenn, you're going to be my driver for my evacuation drill. Glenn, you're a second lieutenant. You're going to be the guy that I send with the Russian instructors, these defectors that we were studying with, and professors, etc., you're going to be the guy that goes with them out to dinner, drinking, and see that they get home. Well, there's many a story I could tell. This was in 1955 and 56, and there was a Chechen by birth professor who had studied with the Red Professorship in Moscow. He was anti-Stalinist to the core. They put him in jail for 5 years, and they released him because they knew he would help against the Germans at that fight in 1943 around the Stalingrad area, I guess. Anyway, he didn't fight. He got on a horse and came over to Germany. And but studying with him was really an experience, and the rest of the professors there, they were really great people. And we had the opportunity to learn from them and to interchange with them. Well, you learn language really well that way, I believe. But I thought when I had graduated that I was able to handle everything. And then I got assigned to the Hotline, Washington-Moscow Hotline. I was one of the first Army people assigned to it as a presidential translator. And all of a sudden, here I am in an exercise in the middle of the night in the bowels of the Pentagon, and somebody is saying, oh, we've just got a message from the Russians, and you've got to translate it. Wow, did I know? Fortunately, it was all fake. They didn't have one. But I suddenly realized how much did I understand the language of these two leaders, one of the free world and one of the communist of the Soviet Union. What were the words they would use? So you started studying, and I was fortunate I was able to do that for 2 years, a lot of study, because we never used the hotline while I was there, analyst. And if you wonder why I'm stressing that point, it's because for about 15, 20 years maybe, I argued that issue with the leadership at NSA, DIA, and other places. You're all linguists. The Army would call you linguists. You're just linguists. How many linguists do you need? It isn't how many linguists you needed, it's how many interpreters you needed with that patrols that you were sending into Iraq or whatever country you were in. After completing my Army career, I was fortunate to be at the forefront of the wave of technology that was being introduced in the form of personal computers in the World Wide Web. I worked in a laboratory called Kepler to integrate the power and speed of the personal computer into the workday of the foreign language analysts. I didn't do it, but the staff that I hired. Interesting, I found out one thing there. We were digitizing everything, we were learning about computers, and the only place I could really find people who were ready to do this were former graduates of music schools. They were really good, and they also had a band that we had afterwards. We learned about the limitations of technology and the opportunities of the same technology to facilitate analysis and understanding of foreign language broadcasts and textual materials. Through the 80s and 90s, the technology builders promised that they had robust systems. How many of you ever faced that in your work day? They had robust systems that were going to soon deliver to you complete replacement for the human. One of our colleagues questioned if the MT promises were really empty. We have since learned to integrate technology into the human system workflow and achieving greater and often more accurate production. The new efforts to produce language prosthetic devices, such as Google earbuds, remind me of what Burroughs wrote in 1963, in which he described these attempts to replace humans in the language field as a desire to build the brain-mind machine. And with it comes the thought, is humanity really prepared for the advent of Kurzweil's singularity? Or that these brain-mind machines that might begin to control humanity? Elon Musk has repeated his doomsday warning about artificial intelligence and its ability to shape and control the human world. And I have read what would seem to be fake news, but I've got to check it out, that New Zealand people living in New Zealand, citizens, will be offered a chance to vote for a political robot candidate named Sam, which has been prepared to answer questions most asked in a campaign for a specific job. Now, check that out. Sam the computer, the voter. Won't that be interesting? 1980, 2001. We all went a little crazy. All sorts of things. The group that I was assigned to at the time, which is the community management staff of the intelligence community, we built the idea for a all-digital environment that would allow us to learn, to pass learning material, and to share the results of our labor across all the agencies. Today, how many years later? We still haven't achieved that. Why? Not because you can't do it, it's because the bosses don't want you to do it, or the local manager doesn't want you to do it. In the case of the linguist, they're going to steal my linguist. They're going to poach the good linguist from this organization. Well, I don't believe so, but it has stopped us from doing that. National Language Registry. There was a senator by the name of Simon. Was it Paul Simon, I think?
Paul Simon.
Paul Simon wanted us in the intelligence community and the State Department to build a directory that would allow all of the people with language capabilities living in this great U.S. with all of our language expertise, would allow them to volunteer their services for use during periods of emergency, such as the earthquake in California, such as the fires of today, such as the hurricanes. Well, Paul Simon and a group of others wanted us to do it, so we set out and we built the concept, and we had everything set to move into the public library system of the United States so that people could use it to make their entries, and then we'd collect the data and have it to call. Well, it didn't happen. What happened was, because of pressures from political and people trying to sell technology, etc., it ended up with two separate things: the National Virtual Translation Center of the FBI today, and the National Language Service Corps, which is run out of the DOD. I have to stop talking about that one, but it is what happens to you along the way when you have great ideas and you happen to be in a place where the leadership is not quite synced on what you're trying to do. And they have so much more on their mind. Let's see, in the aftermath of the Gulf War, the U.S. Congress, led by Senators Paul Simon, Thad Cochran, Boren Akaka, and Leon Panetta, a congressman, directed the DCI to establish an Intelligence Community Foreign Language Committee based on the informal and unchartered foreign language work led by DOD. And that's where I ended up, as the executive secretary to the chairman of that committee. And what a fortunate thing and what a wonderful thing. That ideation and all of that we did, nationwide proficiency testing, we really tried hard, and when I say we, I'm talking about representatives from each of the intelligence agencies and each of the language schools in the government and the State Department and its School of Language Studies especially. Let's see, Father Lee Lubers of Scala. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Scala. I know, Mark, you are, but Scala was a wonderful experiment, and Father Lee Lubers from Creighton University, he looked out one day and saw them installing a bunch of big dishes, satellite dishes for communication. They were going to start receiving signals from other countries. And Lee said, oh, this is interesting. Let's build it so we can teach language. Let's collect all that authentic language material and bundle it and ship it, retransmit it to our school systems. Wonderful idea. And one of the museum's members, Whitney Reed, was the first one to put money into that fatherly labours from the federal government. Scala is a wonderful thing. I don't know how many of you have looked at Scala. The work that's in it is tremendous. The problem is it ought to be free. We did get it when the government decided to fund it. We did get it free for all government agencies. But we could not get it free for education in general, which is what I wanted, and which I think we ought to be working toward to get the Congress to fund it in the Department of Education and not the Department of Defense. Most of these programs were seen by the budgeteers in the higher level organizations as just pigs, just wasting money because you don't keep the people. Well, they're right. We didn't keep the people. U.S. engagement in the Balkans once again showed the lack of language capability, and congressional supporters stirred to give us money and to give us direction. The general in charge of the initial engagement in the Balkans said while he needed 150 linguists, he had only 12, and those 12 were trained in intelligence work and not for working with the POL dump, the gas and lubricant dump, or the logistics of housekeeping in that area of engagement. Now, ILR had been a group of just school people, teachers, and the managers of teachers attending a group mission. At FSI, in the School of Language Service, there was a language studies. There was a gentleman named Frith, who was a colonel in the Air Force, I believe, originally, and he developed this group of people who, working in the schools, wanted to build a way for telling about the proficiency level an individual might attain. You had to, Congress had a commission. They told the State Department and the intelligence people to give us something that will allow us to share that proficiency knowledge across the community. In other words, have it for all the people that the U.S. government is going to be employing. And they came up with the initial skill level descriptors. These skill level descriptors are really today the only thing that stands as a standard for judging a person's proficiency in translation, interpretation, in speaking, in reading, and writing. They are skill level descriptors. They are not standards. They are not tests. And what is lacking to shore up that, so that all the school system can say, is the test development that has to take place. The proficiency test, people say, proficiency testing is the answer. And we spent a lot of money building a lot of automated or nearly automated proficiency systems. But global proficiency in a language, although testable, and they've demonstrated the capability to do it, does not prove that you are a translator or an interpreter. There is so much more to the work of doing a translation. The additional effort that has to take place to learn how to do the research, how to take apart that sentence, take apart that phrase, and trace it to its core meaning, and then transfer that meaning to the desired language. Automated proficiency testing is not going to be the answer. If you're going to get to this stage that we use the skill level descriptors correctly, we will eventually build a national testing system that will allow you to credential these individuals, certify them as translators and interpreters. And until we do, they will continue, most of them, draw lower pay than they deserve for the effort that they put into learning how to do it, and for the work that they are called on to do. They are not paid very highly in the land of professional work, except those who really excel. Those who really excel in interpretation, that six-figure income is rather easily obtained, but at tremendous work. It is a constant study, it is a constant effort to keep up with it. Secretary guidance, we had the Defense Foreign Language Policy Committee, and I left the community management staff to replace Carolyn Crooks in a position in the Pentagon. I don't know how many of you remember Carolyn, but she held a position at the Pentagon where it was only one person who oversaw all of the military language school and assignment of people. And I replaced her in that wonderful job. And the secretary, as a executive of the Defense Foreign Language Policy Committee. The committee was staffed by general officer, by senior civilians, secretary, and as works, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the process that goes on in Pentagon or in higher level U.S. government organizations. You write the guidance to give the document that will tell you what you're supposed to do over the next year. In other words, you write that guidance and you sell it to the chief. Well, we wrote guidance, build a strategic plan to get the secretary to tell us that we needed a strategic plan for language. So September 2001, September 10th, DOD, strategic plan for language not completed. Couldn't get agreement out of people. What are the proficiency levels that are needed? Because it can't measure them otherwise. What proficiency levels are needed in your military? What are needed at your intelligence jobs? What are needed in the diplomatic corps? And nobody could really agree on it. So the strategic plan was not completed. We had requirements for people both in the State Department and in the Defense Department that were fewer than what were really needed in order to do the jobs that were required to provide that constant flow of trained, educated people to perform the missions. The Foreign Language Executive Committee had replaced the DCI foreign language, and that is significant because when they made that executive committee, and if ever Jordan were here today, I wish he were, what we saw was, hey, you can't have a GS 14 or 15 making these kind of decisions. They have to be senior executives. So senior executives, we didn't have too many who spoke language, who knew anything about languages, but they were the ones who sat at the tables and made the decisions. Now, the rest of us were allowed to come into the room and give our opinion or make a presentation. Never give your opinion, though. You got in trouble. Anyway, congressional interest in language was waning, so we weren't sure we were going to get all the funds we needed. And the group received a grant, and the Monterey Institute of International Studies was the recipient of that grant, and they gathered people, language leaders from around the world, teachers, managers, for a conference on language policy and what each country had in the way of language policies, everything from English for, you know, the ESL programs through to foreign languages instruction, native languages, endangered languages. And we were there happy and all dining together and just enjoying life. And then that was Monday, and Tuesday morning we woke up and our world had changed completely. Immediately, the cry came down from the top levels all over, solve the language problem. Well, as Everett and a few others would tell you, and Scott will tell you, you don't solve the language problem. It is a problem that you work with. You try to find people to do the job, etc. But there is no solution to it until you have invented this brain-mind machine, and then you have the problem of transferring that knowledge. So we had to find teachers for the languages of Afghanistan. Look through our government databases. And when we went to the databases, we found there were 140,000 people working in the Pentagon who are working in Department of Defense who had claimed a language when they signed up. And so you went looking for them. Well, didn't turn out so well. They didn't have the capability, they had forgotten it, or they had flat out lied that they spoke the language well or read the language well. And we also found out that that requirement to have these people state their language had been stripped from the application for Defense Department work because it was unnecessary. So you recruit then to find these people for the language of Afghanistan and Iraq, you recruit from the immigrant enclaves. And that leads to a whole set on another entire speech. I think the words up there say just about everything. Establish directory of volunteers with language skills again. All of a sudden that which has failed now came about, and thus we got the National Language Service Corps and the National Virtual Translation Center. Kicked along by 2000. It's funny how much of language growth and capability in language and studies on language have originated as a country goes to war or gets involved in conflict. Is that the only time we realize? Because when you go overseas as a tourist or on a CODEL from the Congress, you're escorted by professional translators and interpreters. But comes along war, and all of a sudden, there's nobody to do it. Translation and interpretation prosthetics. I'm stealing that name from David Christie, who spoke here at one point, I believe. And he was the first one to call those tools that we use, such as the Google earbuds and other tools, as prosthetics. If you don't have a leg, you have a prosthesis. If you don't have language, you need a prosthesis. Emphasis placed on MSA, that's Modern Standard Arabic, when the dialects were needed. You will not believe that it took this august community, myself included, listening to all of the people who really taught Arabic and knew Arabic, we still persisted on Modern Standard Arabic was the goal for everything until about 2006, 2000. And it wasn't until 2008 that we began to write the real requirements and have the courses ready for the dialects of Syria, the dialects of Iraq, the dialects of Egypt, and sub-dialects of sub-dialects. Muddling through, that's what we did. The seniors said language is a commodity. We buy it when we need it. Don't bother to train, it's too expensive. That $500 million a year that you're going to spend on language training, don't need to spend it. Hire it. Why teaching 24 languages at Defense Language Institute? All we need is about 5. And by the way, they all speak English now, don't they? And when you say you need Afghan, I thought that all they spoke was Arabic in all those Arabic countries. This is honestly truth from seniors who get elected to positions or appointed to positions. So the directory of volunteers, I've told you that already. We invest more in better translation, integrate into the human flow, workflow. DoD turned to contractors to find and hire translators and interpreters, and along came the problem of there being no way to test those people, no way to know whether they really spoke that language that you needed. And it was not a pleasant time for anybody assigned as a language officer in Afghanistan or in Iraq. They had to deal with this problem of managing these contractors, supporting our forces in the field, and not sure whether they were really giving those forces in the field the correct assistance. ILR skill level descriptors. During that period, we also found a way for Maria Brau and David, our current, what's his last name,
David Sawyer.
David Sawyer. We found them to lead a group of people to rewrite and write skill level descriptors for translation and interpretation. Now, I don't know how many of you have participated in a process like that. It just takes time and it takes understanding. And you have people like Pardee Lowe, David Sawyer, I'm trying to think of the woman from State Department. Anyway, that group of people really working their hardest and realizing how difficult it was to communicate even within their closed group on some of these concepts. But they made it through. And today, the ILR, which the chairman of the ILR is sitting right here, Scott McGinnis, coordinator chairman, is proud of, and the work is there for the use of people, if now we will find the way to transfer it into those tests that must be built. So, anybody know somebody who's got a few $1 billion to spend on this? Right now, we got greater investment in the schools, and I list 4 schools there. Are there more? It's 5 actually that I have listed there. The ILI is the CIA's Intelligence Language Institute. I think it's still called that. One of the things in dealing with the history of anything, this organizations change their names. That school that Alan Tordenville and I went through was originally called the Detachment R out of the U.S. Army. Then it became the U.S. Army Russian Institute. And then now it is part of the George C. Marshall Center, located in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in Germany. Related associations, and you know them all, the ACTFL, ATA, MLA, they're all doing much better. The Joint National Council on Languages, which is not a lobbying organization, is joined with the National Council of Language Instructional Systems, was the original title, I believe. And that group is a lobbying organization, and once a year they hold a legislation day when they invite teachers from all over the country, language teachers, to come in and lobby their congressmen. And they are assisted in this with speeches and lunches and things to make the congressmen, congressional staffs listen. This past year we received in February the AAAS Commission of 2016 gave us their paper on the need for more and better education in languages. And it's a wonderful book, and it's worthy and available, and you can find it on the web. The problem with it is, I think it mentions translation and interpretation about 7 times in the entire 200 book. There's nothing about what you do with that language once you've learned it, how you make use of it, what you can do to make use of it, is not in that book. And I noticed they changed the title, I believe, from the original. I'll have to go back and make my mind. But they changed from look at language capabilities in the U.S., something like that, to language learning in the U.S. Probably that's because at too many ILR sessions, I asked the question, and what about the pay for these people? What about the jobs for these people? We still have the great problem of not writing job descriptions. The only place that I know of where real job descriptions that are written demanding a lesson, a skill, and a level of that skill are in the intelligence community. The rest of the government is supported, as far as I know, State Department, of course, and the intelligence community. Those are the 2 places where you find it. But you won't find it for the FEMA. They're beginning to do it for the Department of Homeland Security. They have established language programs now, but they are still not writing job descriptions for it because they intend to hire all of their support. Now that brings us to my last point here, need to show return on taxpayer investment. That is the biggest problem that we face. We lobby for money. We lobby for money for teachers of foreign language, for government teaching of languages, education. But nobody asks us to show the return on investment. In other words, what are you really accomplishing with that National Security Language Education Program, the flagship program, the ACTFL sponsored campaign with language? What are you really accomplishing with this taxpayer money? And we need to start doing that. Language education statistics. Man, I saw that ACE report, that's the American Council of International Education, and I looked at that. 54 million enrolled in kindergarten through 12th grade. 10.5 million enrolled in foreign language studies. Wow, think of that. Languages enrolled in. I chose only 5 out of the 12 that they cited within that report, 12 or 15, I can't remember which right now. But I selected 5 that I believe are languages where we need investment, where we need to really understand what those going through, what those other people are thinking about, what they're doing, what they're writing about. And you notice the enrollment, it's quite significant. But then as you move to advanced placement or to international baccalaureate, which would mean the individual has really excelled and is worthy of further study, you only find those few that have been awarded, those few individuals that have been selected. Now, I could say that there may be a whole bunch of them that are going to go ahead and get further education, but I can say I bet that that's about the size you're going to get out of that total number of kids, young people, who went through those programs. A lot of reasons why, I won't go into them, but I wanted you to see that because it's quite startling. Now, I had a whole thing written on language acquisition, but I'm talking to people that are professionals in it, so I won't give all that. But from personal experience, observation in classroom with others and in observation of myself, auditory and visual acuity are an important part of language learning. If you have deficiencies in either one of those, you're probably going to have a difficult time in learning a language. The motivation, student motivation. What motivates students? Is it the teacher that can motivate them, or is it something outside? Is their parents? It's what is it that you can help to motivate them to study? And if Ms. Harrison could answer that question easily, I'm sure. The engagement, the student engagement. How do you get that student to engage with the teacher and with the course material? Enthusiasm of the persona on the part of the teacher. I flunked Latin 3 years in a row in high school because the teacher didn't, it just wasn't there. It wasn't fun. It was learn this in this way and this way only, and competence, teacher competence and credentials. We still have not reached that point where most of the foreign language teachers in this country are truly credentialed. We're relying on the states to credential, and what it has to be is a national credentialing system as far as I'm concerned. You're going to need to go through the National Accreditation Council and have the institutions teaching teachers how to teach accredited. Okay, I talked enough about that. I've almost run out of my time. Foreign language business. Everybody says we did a wonderful thing with NAFTA. we created something called the North American Industrial, and I forget the last two words, but there is translation and interpretation services, data being collected by the Census Department to support this NAFTA agreement. We're going to study this. There are 2,494, 2,500 establishments, 55 of those are nonprofit, that are doing this translation and interpretation services. They have sales of 4.1 billion. They have a payroll of 1 billion or over 1 billion. Well, the problem with looking at this, and the primary customer, by the way, in 2017 is the US government at 2 billion of that field. The problem with the data is that it includes role players for the military, where we build villages and have people speaking the native language act the roles. We have sign language interpreters included within it. And I'll bet you I'll find some coders in there as well, some computer coders. But that is, sort of makes me think, where can the National Museum of Language find some funds to support their growth and to build the building? Probably one of those corporations getting that $2 billion there could probably afford a few thousand to help you. Maybe $500,000 is what I'd ask for. Language labor. Now here comes the problem. Notice the difference between the number of jobs for translators and interpreters as opposed to the number of positions that were held in the other. You have 68,000. Once again, it includes sign language interpreters. So we've got to get the government talking to each other before you can find the data you need in order to make your case with the Congress or with whatever the leadership you're having to deal with. How many languages are there? Interesting. Ethnologue, about 7,000 human languages and dialects in 1993. Today it's 7,099. Well, I have trouble with that because many of those languages in that 799 are gone, long gone. They're in the endangered, or there's only 20 people alive speaking them. And that's all sad, but don't try to scare the government with the fact that it's 7,099 languages they need to pay for. And people try that, unfortunately. I've seen real good leaders in this business stand up and argue because I got 7,000 languages to deal with. You gotta help. Well, sorry, there aren't 7,000 languages. There's probably about 150, but that's another story that I would spare you from today. National Security Education Program, say, awards grants for study of 60 languages. The Critical Language Support Program awards grants for a study of 14. Delencio, which is also associated with the NSEP, awards grants for study of 23. And the DoD authorizes proficiency pay to 41. Now somewhere in there, there's a sort. My own language for what we need to be paying for today is somewhere around 20 languages that we need to really put investment into. And beyond that, we need to work on the rest of that 150. But 20 is probably what you need. Forward. And this is the end. I encourage dual language education initiatives. And the reason for it is it takes all of these heritage speakers, it takes all of this immigrant populace, and helps them grow into good citizens, into good workers, and brings their native heritage language with them into the workplace. I want to find in the middle and high school, we put a bunch of money, taxpayers, you put a bunch of money every year into high school and middle school language programs. Why aren't we seeking out and identifying those learners that are really going to want to excel and can excel in language learning? It Shouldn't take a lot to do that, but we haven't done it yet. We need to offer to those high performers in middle school and high school the opportunity that we offer for military jobs. In other words, sign up for 6 years. And in that 6 years, the first year you'll spend really learning that language that you've been studying. And then we'll help you get your tuition for college, and we'll help you get your college education while you're working for us. 6 years. Establish a professional military language corps. Every year, the DLI-FLC graduates about 2,500 linguists. Now, they claim a little higher figure than that some years. Every year. And for the past 20 years, take 2,500 times 20, that's quite a few linguists. Where are they all? Every year, that same number, 2,500, departs from the service. Departs from their service because either they're not given work to do, or there's no promotion for them, or they don't like the Army, don't like the Navy. But it's every year. Scott, am I right or wrong on that? And so what we need to do is take that and offer them a 20-year career as a professional language specialist, doing translation and interpretation for any part of the U.S. government. And I would do that for that same civilian job corps that I've spoken about. And you have to weave that into a 20-year to lifetime career. You really shouldn't let people like me go away from the translation and interpretation business and get into management. You ought to keep them. You ought to pay them enough to keep them there so they don't go find another job. Write job descriptions for full-time and adjunct translation and interpretation jobs. And I think I've spoken on that before today, but we really don't write those job descriptions, either in industry or in the government, that specify a language, the depth of knowledge of that language, in order to do the job. Build national accreditation and certification program, and you see it for translators, interpreters, teachers, and testers. And until we get a national program like that and fund it, we're going to be in trouble. Now, I'd like to say one more thing about the National Museum of Language, and that was a dream of, I would like to call her a dear friend, but all I can say is she was a friend because we lived so far apart. We spent a lot of time on telephone. I think I was probably, other than Peter Gazumblik, who was a DLI representative, I think I was about the first one outside of her close-knit family that listened to her on the topic and gave her encouragement about it. And I was on the board for a while, and I was an associate for a while. Lately, I've just come to donate a little bit of money. And today, where I would normally ask for $500 to stand up and rave and rant at you good folks, I'm donating that to the National Museum of Language. You take care. I hope that there's questions. If anybody has questions you'd like to force on.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Floor is open for questions.
As you look forward into the next 20, 30, 40 years and technology and artificial intelligence evolve, isn't that going to have a tremendous impact on this? And what do you think the future for human translators and interpreters is going to be?
According to those who really consult and study in this business, they say we're going to have many more jobs. They're going to be in translation and interpretation. They see over the numbers that I showed you, they see an increase on the tens of thousands. Because you got to do post-editing on all of that work. Now, until they invent that machine with the brain-mind machine that'll handle that editing and do the necessary research to make sure that editing is correct, until they invent it, they're going to have humans. And those humans will be the very point that saves a corporation or the government from taking a bit of information that has been translated in error and using that information for action, for investment, or for engagement.